Yeah, my talk is entitled "The Science of Psilocybin" or "The Biology of Psilocybin." And I realize that a lot of people have different backgrounds here, so I'll try to break things down as much as possible. And if anything is unclear, just ask me a question at the end. There'll be plenty of time for question and answer. And so let's jump in. So overview, I'm going to talk briefly about what psilocybin is from a scientific perspective, and then provide a brief historical overview of the research that's been done to date and how psilocybin has entered kind of the Western context. And talk briefly about psilocybin assisted therapy. What is it? How is it done in the studies? And what are some of the main findings to date using psilocybin assisted therapy for different mental health conditions? And then I'm going to give a very, very quick overview of psilocybin effects on the brain, and then talk a bit about what I'm excited about in terms of the future of psilocybin research. And so first, to get us started, so what is psilocybin? As you all know at this point, psilocybin is a compound in so-called magic mushrooms, most commonly psilocybe cubensis, but it's found in over 200 different species of fungi worldwide. And yeah, here I'm in the Pacific Northwest around Vancouver. You know, if you know what you're looking for, it's pretty easy to find them in the right season. And what makes psilocybin interesting is that it stimulates this particular brain receptor associated with your serotonin system in your brain called the serotonin 2A receptor. And we know that if you block this receptor and give somebody a bunch of psilocybin or a bunch of LSD for that matter, they just won't have an experience, they won't trip. And so we know from that and other studies that this particular brain receptor seems to be very essential to the effects of psilocybin on consciousness. And to frame how psilocybin affects people in a very scientific way, you could say it elicits alterations to our perception. So our perception of the external world, our cognition, which is just our thinking, our emotion, self-explanatory, and our sense of self, our sense of being this person with this set of traits and this personal history, and that's located within this body. That can also be altered, as many of you may be aware. And the interesting thing about psilocybin is that its effects are very dependent on what we might call contextual factors, or what people refer to as set and setting. That is, if you take a stimulant or you drink some alcohol, you're fairly certain of what the effects are going to be. But if you take a psychedelic, it could widely range depending on your set, which is what you psychologically bring to the experience in terms of your expectations, your mental state, your beliefs, and so on. And then your setting, which is your environment that you're in, which encompasses physically, what is your physical environment like, socially, what are the types of people you're around, and what are their their vibes and how they're influencing you. Then also more broadly, your cultural setting. What is kind of the agreed upon norms of what's real and what's not real, and what's important, not important. And that's also, you can say, the higher level culture in which you're embedded also affects your experience. And we know from research now, and many people, outside the research context, when combined with therapy or psychological support or done with intention, can be effective for treating mental health conditions and also helping people gain access to insights and new perspectives. So that's psilocybin. So overview, a very, very, very quick, brief, incomprehensive, selective overview of psilocybin, of the history of psilocybin. So it was introduced to the Western world in 1957 by this banker named Gordon Wasson and his partner, who were the first Westerners to go and experience mushrooms down in Mexico with a shaman named Maria Sabina. And they did it. They were the first to take part in this very ritualistic ceremony that was deeply embedded in the indigenous cultures down there. And then they went on to share their story in Life magazine, which was a widely circulated magazine at the time. Like, think about it. They didn't have social media. They didn't have the internet. People had these subscriptions to these magazines, and everyone read it. You were certain, a large portion of the population will read it. And so it was very widely circulated and read, and this big article, I guess, called Seeking the Magic Mushroom, where they detailed their journey down to Mexico and their experience with it. And obviously people got interested. This is like a fascinating thing. And then a year later, Albert Hoffman, the chemist who discovered LSD, found out that in these mushrooms was a compound that he named psilocybin, um, which is very structurally similar to serotonin and so on. And so they found that there's a particular compound within it that seems to be related to the effects. And then, 4 years later, another milestone was the so-called Good Friday experiment, which was done by this, at the time, a PhD student named Walter Pahnke at Harvard University, doing his PhD at the Divinity School. And his supervisor was Timothy Leary, which is interesting. I'm sure many people are familiar with him. And in this study, they were trying to find out, can psilocybin induce mystical experiences similar to those reported by saints and mystics and so on? And long story short, they did find that yes, in the particular context they gave it in, which was a Good Friday sermon at a chapel in Boston, and they found that these divinity students who were part of the study, many of them had these profound mystical type experiences. And this is fascinating. It's groundbreaking to be able to induce that kind of experience. So naturally, this led to more interest in psilocybin. And then over the next decade and a half, there were, although most of the psychedelic research during this time was with LSD, there was a lot of work with psilocybin as well, looking at its use in therapy, as well as, stuff related to this Good Friday experiment. And so, as we know, in the end of the 60s, with the Controlled Substance Act and other, all sorts of political, sociocultural currents and everything, this stuff, psilocybin became illegal. It became very hard to research it, and more importantly, funding was very hard to get by for academics, and it looked bad for their reputation at the time to engage with psychedelic research, and so it just kind of stopped stuff. And then much later, 2006, you could say this whole psychedelic renaissance was initiated when the Johns Hopkins researchers, in the group led by Roland Griffiths, replicated that early Good Friday experiment and showed again, using more rigorous standards of, controlling the context, making it more neutral, and having a placebo control, and all this, they again found that psilocybin can induce mystical experiences. Fast forward, the first ever trial for depression was in 2016 at Imperial College London, and they found that psilocybin, in this study, they did one low dose and one higher dose of psilocybin, and found that people had reductions in depression that lasted 6 months after. So this is, and I'll dive more into that later. So this is the first study showing the potential of psilocybin for depression. And since then, there's been 2 other trials looking at it, and many that are currently ongoing. So that's a broad history of it. And then, so next, very quickly, psilocybin-assisted therapy. So what is it, right? So how is psilocybin used in therapy to treat things like depression? And so you don't just give psilocybin to somebody and then they're better and then, and then you're done. There's a lot of psychotherapy that goes into it. And this consists of preparation. So before the experience, let me back up. So this image here just shows how it's usually done. There's usually 2 therapists, one male, one female, and the person will be lying in a reclined posture with eye shades on and listen to music in a pre-selected playlist. And so it's really important for these, for psilocybin-assisted therapy, as with any therapy, is building strong rapport, and you could say interpersonal connection between the therapist and the patient or the client. And so prior to having their session, there's preparation sessions where this kind of rapport is built, and the client or patient speaks and shares about the things they're going through. Let's say they're a depression patient, then what is the relationship to the depression? How does it show up? What are the themes that come up? What is their understanding of where my life came from? And exploring all this stuff. And in preparation, the therapist also kind of provide what's called psychoeducation. So this education on how to understand and handle and approach the psychedelic experience. Usually is approach it with a sense of curiosity and surrender, trust, and openness. Those are critical aspects of it. And then during the drug session, it's like this, and you have two therapists on your side. And it's really, they're just telling you to go inwards. They're not, micromanaging and trying to control the experience. They're just trying to make sure you feel safe and secure to go deep into yourself and go where the psilocybin directs you. And so that's a drug session. So it's a very, you're focusing on the effects of the psilocybin rather than the therapist trying to do it themselves. And then afterwards, really important is doing follow-up sessions in what's called psychedelic integration. So people have a very profound and complex experience. And then afterwards, it's like, okay, how do you make sense of this? How do you bring it back into your day-to-day life in terms of actions you can take, things you can do, things you could change? And that process is referred to as psychedelic integration. So when you do psilocybin assisted therapy, you have this multiple sessions of preparation, the drug session, which can usually be 1 to 3 in the studies, and then follow-up sessions with the psychotherapist as well. And, it's important to emphasize that this is a very controlled setting where they're controlling the environment you're in, controlling the people around you, and they're really talking a lot about, trying to influence your mindset in a way that gives you a sense of openness and curiosity to the experience. And this is all very important because this is a very different way of taking psilocybin than doing it with your friends in an informal setting. You mentioned this, the importance of a strong therapeutic relationship and importance of feeling safe, secure, and able to surrender. So that's psilocybin assisted therapy and how it's usually conducted. And so let's talk about some findings. So for depression, as I mentioned, there was this one, the first trial done in 2016, and I have it here described as an open label feasibility trial. And what that just means is that they didn't have a control group. Usually you want a control group of people who receive a placebo that you compare to, but this was just trying to find out, in just a sample of people without any comparisons, is it safe and effective for depression? In just a first pass kind of look. And here's a little figure here. So these black little things represent their depression score, which is used this metric called QIDS, which is a commonly used depression scale where you fill out a bunch of questions and rate them from 1 to 7. And so here is baseline. So baseline, they were around 20 in their score, which is, means they're going to be depressed, basically. And then 1 week after one high dose session, they drop below 10, and which is a significant reduction. And even at 5 weeks, they're still below 10. At 3 months, they come back up, but they're still nowhere near. They're maybe at like 12 instead of 18, which is a large difference here. And even at 6 months later, this is maintained. So this is quite crazy. After like essentially one high dose session, 6 months later, they're still not nearly near how depressed they were before. And then in another study more recently, they did a similar thing where one group received psilocybin about a month after the other to compare, if these people just live their life as normal versus getting psilocybin, how is the difference? What is the difference in depression? And you can see here that, at the baseline, they're the same. And then there's the subjects or patients who didn't get psilocybin until after week 8, they're the delayed treatment. Their depression scores stayed very similar over those 2 months. Whereas with psilocybin, you get it and boom, you're way down, very, very low. And this was sustained at week 8. And then for the same study, it was a follow-up. So now this is like a larger time scale, which this is 12 months. And again, you can see on average, they went from up here above 20 on this different metric, but very similar to the one in the other study. They went and dropped all the way down here, and this was maintained. And even it was stronger at 12 months than it was at 1 week, showing you getting these sustained reductions in depression, again, based on like only a couple experiences, which is very different than other antidepressants. But important thing to acknowledge is that these are averages across people, right? If you look at individual people, it's kind of crazy, right? It's very messy. And this is why it's so important to recognize that psychedelics aren't this magic bullet that help everybody, and people's trajectories at the individual level are very complex. Like for example, if you see there's like a peak here, I hope you can see my cursor. There's like a peak orange. If you look where they started, if you try to trace this, it's like over here somewhere. And so they dropped down and then they had a massive rebound at 3 months and then went flying back down to at 6 months. And now they came back and they're actually not too far from where they started. So that's, an example of what somebody can do. Whereas the majority, if you look, they start up here and then they end up farther down here. So those are pretty big differences. But you could see it's not just they're just instantly better and then it's sustained. There is fluctuations and many who rebound back. And some people like this person up here who just, is basically the same as where they started. So it's complex. People respond differently. Not everyone gets better. Some people need maybe more sessions. And it's unclear how many sessions are necessary for someone to be better the rest of their life. If, depending on whether that's possible for certain people or not, we don't know that because it really is a question we have to study. And so I just really want to emphasize this, how, there's so much variability across people in how they respond and their own trajectory with their symptoms after, and so on. And then there's a third looking at depression. This one actually directly compared psilocybin to a SSRI, so like a standard antidepressant. And on the measure they chose, which is one of 4 depression measures in this trial, red is psilocybin, blue is escitalopram, the antidepressant. And you can see, immediately psilocybin is significantly lower than it, but then they're actually pretty similar. And at the end, there's actually, in this measure, no statistical difference between them, which is interesting. But on one side, one way to look at this is like, that's pretty impressive because escitalopram, you're taking this thing every day, you have the side effects, you're dependent on it. Whereas this was after 1 dose of psilocybin here and then a second dose here. And so it's like you're taking psilocybin twice and there's no lasting side effects. You have the experience and then maybe you have a headache the next day is a common thing, but you're not taking it every day. And yet you're getting the same, more or less, same and slightly better outcomes relative to this antidepressant. But an interesting thing here is that although the antidepressant score was similar in this measure, changes in well-being were very different. So in escitalopram, there was very little increase in well-being, whereas in psilocybin there was. So this means that even though escitalopram reduced depression scores, it didn't necessarily make people feel better in a positive way. And as we know, antidepressants usually just kind of dull people's emotions to some extent and make them just able to function rather than making them feel amazing and better in a genuine sense. So this shows psilocybin actually increased their well-being by a significant amount. They were like down near 0 up to almost 15, whereas they're still at 5 with escitalopram. And so psilocybin is clearly doing something different than escitalopram and making people feel better as opposed to just less depressed. And this is also captured here in a variety of other measures. So how do we interpret this, right? So just look on the right here. And this dotted line is 0, meaning no difference between psilocybin and the antidepressant. And if you go left, that means it's better for psilocybin. If you go right, that means it's better for the antidepressant. And you can see there's nothing on the right. There's nothing that was better for the antidepressant, for escitalopram. And if you look here, these first 4 are measures of depression. So this was the main thing where they found no significant difference. But actually, that was the exception out of the other measures, which they should have used as their primary measure for various reasons, but we can get into that. So the other ones show significantly better antidepressant effects for psilocybin. This one too is very interesting. It's avoidance. So how much do you avoid difficult emotions and experiences? That was significantly reduced with psilocybin. You're less avoidant. And then, another relevant one is flourishing. How much do you feel like you're living a life that's meaningful and fulfilled? Much more in psilocybin, and again, well-being also. And so, so just super promising that with 1 to 3 experiences, you get all these positive increases in people and depression effects that rival or beat a kind of standard antidepressant. So that's the depression research. Another thing that's been applied for is for cancer patients who got a terminal diagnosis and have a lot of anxiety and depression around their death, which is coming not too far away. And these are a bit more complex, but let's look at these top two here, where my cursor is, had anxiety and had depression. And the purple is people who didn't receive psilocybin. And then blue is those who did. And the green lines show the different sessions where they received psilocybin. And so you can see it's kind of similar before the first session, then after. The anxiety score for psilocybin in the purple dropped lower, and it stayed lower. And then, wait 1 second. Oh, so what happened was, yeah, so like in these first sessions, only the purple group got it. And then the second one, the blue group also got it. So you can see in the first initial stages, a large difference in the group that got it first, and then you get a similarity. And then, interestingly, in this one, we constantly get differences in the group that got it first. But the bottom line here is that, again, psilocybin, even with one session, significantly reduced scores of depression and anxiety in these people who, were anxious about their death. And this study was done at NYU. And then at the same time, there was also one done at Johns Hopkins, which found very similar things. Where again, blue is people who didn't receive it, who received it at post 2 here, so the third dot. And so when the first group got it, they had significant lower scores. And then when the second group gets it, then they align again. So they went from the same to one gets psilocybin, one doesn't, then you get a big difference. This one's much lower. And then when this group got it, then they join them down here. And this again is for depression and anxiety, and also quality of life and death acceptance too. So these people were, having these experiences where they were able to accept their death and their imminent death and change their relationship to it, and this reduced their depression and anxiety. And again, think about how different this is from just giving them an antidepressant and making them feel better artificially. It's like here they're actually having these experiences which help them understand and come to terms with where they're at in their life and be able to let go and accept death. It's a massive thing. And so it's powerful that psilocybin can be used for that, and is like far beyond and far different than any other treatment we can offer people. Another thing is helping people quit smoking. They found that in a study of 18 people, so the black squares indicate how much of basically nicotine or metabolite of nicotine is in their pee. And they found that in 15 out of 18 people, there was 0 even at 6 months later. So that means like something like 80% of people in this study quit smoking after their psilocybin session, which is a massive increase over any other treatment that's ever been used for treating tobacco addiction. Usually it's around maybe 30%, maybe 1/3, but this was over 2/3 and almost like 3/4 of people quit smoking afterwards. And I don't include it here, but these people who quit had higher scores on mystical experiences. So they felt these experiences of dissolving and becoming one with the universe and being connected to something greater than themselves. And this made them just like see how ridiculous and unnecessary smoking was, and they were able to let go of it. And there's studies showing basically that they saw, how can I just experienced such a profound experience and saw the potential of life and the beauty of it, and why am I getting bogged down smoking something that's damaging my body and potentially contribute to a lower life expectancy? And so they quit, and that's powerful. And recently, Matt Johnson, who led this initial study back in 2014, got a $4 million USD grant from the National Institute of Mental Health, which is a major federal kind of body in the United States, to study psilocybin for helping people quit smoking. And that was the first major grant given by a government to study psychedelics since the 60s. And so it signals a massive change in how these massive bodies, funding bodies, are viewing psychedelics and their potential. And then also for alcoholism, this was again showing, these ones are showing how much they're drinking, number of days drinking, number of heavy days drinking. And this is baseline, so they're pretty high. For a psilocybin treatment around here, and then boom, it goes down. And even 36 weeks later, they're still much lower than they were before. And this was a study done in 2015 showing, yeah, again, effectiveness for alcoholism. And recently, just like a few weeks ago, another one came out, a more rigorous, larger trial by the same group, which took them many years to do and millions of dollars of funding. And again, they found that compared to a different drug, which is just basically supposed to act as a placebo, you get significantly reduced drinking. Like it's the blue one is psilocybin, the darker one is the other drug, which lasts a long time, 36 weeks again, which is what they've studied so far, showing that again, like, psilocybin assisted therapy seems to be a very powerful intervention for reducing alcoholism, and potentially better than any other option that we have available right now. And so tons of potential there as well. And then also, there was a study showing effectiveness for OCD, but this was a very small, just like 9 people, but everyone in that group had reductions in OCD symptoms, which were present for a full 24 hours after taking psilocybin. And then right now, if you search, there's this website called clinicaltrials.gov, anybody can go to, and you can search psilocybin on there, and it tells you all the clinical trials, that are using psilocybin for mental health conditions or physical health conditions. And there are 116 studies ongoing. If you search this, maybe, I don't know, 5 years ago, there maybe be, I don't know, 5 or 10 or something. It's crazy how much is being done currently. And they're studying psilocybin for PTSD, for anorexia, for meth addiction and other forms of substance abuse, even for early Alzheimer's disease, and for phantom limb pain, for people who, for example, lost a limb but still feel pain as if they had a limb. This is like a thing. And it helps them, helps their body realize that that limb isn't there, so it should stop sending them pain signals. Very interesting. It seems somebody's also researching it for that. And more, there's over 100 of these trials, so it's crazy the amount of potential psilocybin has to treat a variety of disorders. And now very quickly, let's talk about brain effects. So as I mentioned before, the serotonin 2A receptor is most important for psychedelic effects of psilocybin. But psilocybin also affects a whole variety of other, serotonin receptors and a particular dopamine receptor to some extent, and other receptors as well. So it's very complex in how it affects the brain, but this particular receptor, again, is the most important. And what's interesting, if you look at the bottom left here, red indicates the parts of the brain that have the highest amounts of this receptor. And if anybody knows their functional brain anatomy, these areas very strongly overlap with the default mode network, as well as prefrontal cortex. So it's basically the case that this receptor is most located in regions that are kind of most important for humans and most expanded in humans relative to other primates and other animals. So these like very human specific regions that are very interconnected with the rest of the brain and very important for these kind of more complex aspects of our thinking have the highest amounts of these receptors. And when you activate this receptor, what it does is it makes the brain cells or neurons more active. They're more excitable. They start firing and activating much more than they're usually activating. And what this does is this makes everything a bit more crazy in these regions and disintegrates how they're usually very coordinated and firing specific patterns. But now they're just like activating a bit crazy and out of sync with each other. And this blurs kind of functional boundaries. So regions which usually are distinct from each other and which process different types of information and which fire in different patterns are now just all blending and mixing together to a greater degree. So it's like disintegrating and making it more entropic is one way to say it, a bit more unpredictable. And then we scale up, I'll just say what this picture means. So this picture, purple means lower, and this is basically telling you how integrated, or so how much are these brain cells firing in synchrony with each other? How much are they firing at the same time? And it's reduced, and it's particularly reduced in areas of the default mode network. So again, this reflects a kind of disintegration of the coordinated activity of brain cells. And when this scales up to the level of the whole brain, you probably all seen this picture here at the bottom. The brain becomes much more connected. So now, the brain is usually very it controls what regions talk to what other regions, and some regions barely talk to others, and some are negatively correlated with others, and so on. And with psilocybin, because it's making neurons more excitable, it leads to this increase in connectivity where the brain becomes much more connected. And when the brain is more connected, you can understand that if there's all these different connections going on, then there's different patterns that the brain can go into. If there's only 5 connections, then those can only go into, let's say, 25 different patterns. But if there's 100 connections, then you can go whatever 100 squared is, and 10,000, I think, or more than that, I don't know. But you can go into a whole variety of more patterns. And then what that means is that over time, the brain is more complex or entropic. Another way to say it is that it's more unpredictable. It can go explore an expanded set of brain states, which internally might relate to a feeling that your brain is entering into modes of thinking and perceiving that usually you don't have access to. And okay, here's a cool, this is very abstract, but let's talk about this far bottom right one. One way to understand how our brain and how our mind transitions between different thoughts is that we're moving in this landscape, which has these kind of basins, these like pits that you can fall into. And one of these pits can be, worries about your job. Another one could be, you thinking how you're not as successful as you want to be or whatever. And so your brain naturally is moving through this landscape, and there are certain pits that you can fall into, and you might get stuck in there, and then you'll be kind of negatively ruminating, and you just can't get this out of your head. And so you can think of that as your brain getting stuck in a particular state. And so there's a landscape of different states you can fall into. Some are deeper than others. Some are harder to escape from. And the idea is, by making the brain more interconnected and more complex, these pits are less deep. So now you'll go into that state, but you can hop out much more easily. And that allows you to explore a whole variety of different types of thinking without getting stuck in whatever you habitually normally think about. And so it's kind of freeing your brain and your mind and your psychology, again, to escape ruts and to be more flexible. And so we can say, broadly speaking, that under psilocybin, your brain becomes more integrated, more complex in its dynamics, and more flexible. You're less likely to get stuck in habitual ways of thinking and perceiving. And then you might be wondering, I didn't even mention the default mode network. I barely did. And a lot of people equate that with psychedelic effects these days. There's a reason why, and it's because I think it's been overhyped a lot. And I have a video on this on my YouTube channel, if you go on the Psychedelic Scientist on YouTube. And, here's some points why, right? So one, many other networks are just as disintegrated under psychedelics as the default mode network. If you look on the right here, all these blue bars, so each of these numbers is a different brain network. And these blue bars, you can see it's going negative. The blue bars represent integrity. How integrated is it? And you can see this visual network is super disintegrated, and so is every other network. And here's a DMN, and it's integrated down to, what is it, like -30 or something, -25. So you can see all these other networks are also disintegrated, some more than the DMN. How can we just highlight this, one of these 12 networks in this case, and say this is the most important one, right? We can't. We know the default mode network is involved in interesting things, but we can't just jump from that to saying that it's central to psychedelic effects without statistically showing that to be the case. And also, the DMN becomes disintegrated after certain SSRIs, after taking MDMA, after smoking salvia. Old people just generally have less integrated default mode network. They're not, perpetually experiencing ego dissolution or anything like that. So it's very complex. The default mode network is involved with a lot of things. It could be decreased in different ways. And we can't clearly link that to the psychedelic experience yet. Again, because some studies have found a correlation between default mode network disintegration and ego dissolution. So the sense that our sense of self is being dissolved, which is it's a common experience at higher doses of psilocybin. But there have been a few studies which didn't find that correlation, and some that found correlations with other regions or other measures of the brain. And so it's much more complex. Like the DMN Sorry, I wrote DMT disintegration. That should say DMN, as in the default mode network. Um, and yeah, the brain is much more complex with that. The default mode network is not equivalent to the ego. You can't turn off your default mode network. That's nonsense. And we don't have reliable evidence that the default mode network is associated with ego dissolution with psychedelics yet. It might be the case, but we just can't say that based on existing data. And so, yeah, our certainty about it, there, as talked about by Michael Pollan and in the media, is overblown. Any researcher will tell you that, and more research is needed. And another interesting thing that psychedelics do, which you've probably heard of, is that they boost neuroplasticity. And this is mostly being in studies either with rat brains or in a dish, of looking at neurons in a dish, in vitro, as we call it. And specifically, increases in dendritogenesis, spinogenesis, and synaptogenesis. What do these mean? So let's look at this picture on the right. So dendritogenesis means the creation of new dendrites. And so what dendrites are at the top of this. This is a neuron, it's a brain cell. And so dendrites are where neurons receive inputs from other neurons. So a neuron will send its outputs, and then the receiving station of the second neuron is this dendrites. And so at the top here, you can see these little branches, which are different colors. This is showing that there's more of them after you take a psychedelic. So there's more ways that the connections of other neurons can hit this neuron, which can change its connectivity, change their relationship to each other. And spinogenesis is if you zoom in on one of these dendrites, the specific parts where the other neuron can connect have these little spines or protrusions. And so there's more of those as well. So there's more branches, and there's more of this little landing spots on these branches for other neurons to connect to that neuron. And this last one, synaptogenesis, follows from the other two, because the synapse is the particular, is the coming together of two neurons, you could say. And so there's this, basically, it gives neurons more of an ability to be connected to and modulated by other neurons. And then that could be molded after through experience. And so this is what it means for your brain to become more plastic and neurons to have more ways to interact and wire with each other. It's important to note that most people don't recognize this, that neuroplastic effects and their relationship to depression, say, have not been shown in humans, because it's very hard to look at this. You have to, with rats, you have to cut up their brain and image them using imaging methods. And in vitro, you're just looking at a neuron in a dish, which you can look at it with a microscope, but you can't look at a living brain with a microscope. And so you need to find indirect ways of measuring neuroplasticity. And this has been done by Taylor Lyons, working with Robin Carhart-Harris and others. This was done in London at Imperial College. And other studies where they found these kind of, they came up with ways with which you can study neuroplasticity in humans and related them to things like changes in well-being. And that stuff will be published probably in the next year or so. So that's coming. And in terms of the future of psilocybin research, you can expect many more clinical trials with more subjects and for more conditions. As I showed you, there was 116 ongoing, which is quite crazy. And that's just in North America. And we can see more brain imaging studies with more participants. This is important because you really need a lot of people's brains scanned in order to get a reliable sense of what's going on, just because there's so much variability across people, and there's other difficulties with collecting data with psychedelics. And people are going to be combining them. It's like with tasks, like instead of just putting you in the scanner and telling you to sit there and do nothing for 10 minutes while you're being scanned, it's like get them to do a task related to attention or creativity or perception or memory, to see how these things are altered, and really probe what is psychedelics, what is psilocybin doing to the brain. And then also we need to measure what's happening to people subjectively. And obviously there are ways we can assess this, but the important thing about psychedelics, or like the obvious thing, is that it's such a complex experience that's constantly changing over time. So if somebody has an 8-hour experience, then you give them a questionnaire and ask them, even just like, how much did you experience ego dissolution? It's like, how do you answer that? How do you average over an 8-hour experience? and give one number. Oh, it's a 6 out of 7. It's like at the end of the day, like how accurate is that going to be? So we need better measures, like phenomenological measures that capture variation in time and get into a more kind of refined and specific way of measuring these effects. And also, yeah, studies that collect a lot of measures of, you know, their relation to their emotions, their tendencies in relationships, their beliefs about themselves, and so on. Collect these measures before and after they do psilocybin to see how is their mind changing, how is their psyche changing, how does their relationship to themselves and the world change. And so more studies looking at that as well are on the way. And also, you know, studies looking at how can we optimize effects and personalize treatment approaches. You know, there's studies at UCSF that are going to be underway soon, combining like assessments of physiology, like heart rate variability, and different stress response variables with brain measures, with psychological measures, to see how they all relate and how different people respond in different ways at a very physiological and also brain level, and how we can use that to predict, you know, like say like this person with these characteristics at baseline, this personality, these physiological, you know, this type of heart rate variability, this whatever, how can we predict based on that whether we should give them a higher or lower dose, whether we should give them a particular, you know, environment when they're taking it, and how we should handle them in the therapeutic setting. You know, that's the kind of the future, is how to personalize and optimize for people, for therapy, to maximize safety for them, but also efficacy for improving their well-being or reducing their symptoms. And so definitely that's going to be a priority, I think, moving forward. And then also just more studies looking at how does this stuff work? How does it work in the brain? You know, what are the properties of the brain that are induced by psychedelics? And how can we use that to understand how the brain creates our experience, creates our sense of self more generally as well. And yeah, so that's it for the presentation. Here are some, if you want to dive into some research literature, this stuff is not that technical or dense, but don't quote me on that. I don't know if you want to screenshot this. These are some great review papers, which are very useful to read. And I think an entry point, the best entry point might be this Johnson paper, which is a good review of stuff, and it should be very readable. And it covers a lot of interesting things here in a relatively easy to understand way. And another thing, I have to shamelessly plug myself. I do have a YouTube channel where I talk about basically stuff I talked about today in more detail and try to break down the science in a way that's easy to understand. I haven't made a video in a little while because I've been busy, but I intend on getting to it later this year and being, you know, posting regular weekly videos on different topics. And I'm always open to suggestions on topics too, and breaking this stuff down. And I'm on, it's the Psychedelic Scientist on YouTube and also on Instagram. And yeah, if anybody wants to get in touch with me, Instagram is a great way. Just follow me and DM me, and with anything, with any suggestions for videos or even questions, and I'm happy to answer. And I also, before I close, I have this is my email. I'm also on Twitter at mgurnneuro, and you can also find me on LinkedIn, just my name, Manesh Gurn. And so, yeah, thank you so much. Hope this was easy to follow, and happy to answer any questions.